Bienvenidos a una nueva conversación con el Libero. Esta vez vamos a tratar un tema muy importante para lo que es el mundo, Chile en particular. Vamos a conversar sobre el concepto o las ideas usualmente atribuidas al neoliberalismo. Vamos a hablar de la Escuela de Chicago, vamos a hablar de Milton Friedman y de la inflación, y para eso nos acompaña uno de los más grandes expertos mundiales en temas de inflación, que es Steve Hanke, que es profesor de Economía Aplicada de la Universidad Johns Hopkins en Estados Unidos. Es además codirector del Instituto para Economía Aplicada, Salud Global y Negocios de esa misma universidad. Él ha sido un profesor muy destacado durante décadas en Estados Unidos. También fue asesor económico del presidente Reagan en Estados Unidos y de muchísimos gobiernos que han tenido que lidiar con el problema de la inflación y que van desde Sudamérica hasta gobiernos en Europa del Este y otras partes del mundo que han enfrentado en los 90 y en otros periodos problemas severos en términos de inflaciones desatadas. Y Steve Hanke ha sido asesor que les ha ayudado a estos gobiernos controlar la inflación, y de hecho ha sido condecorado por el gobierno de Albania por sus servicios a esa nación en esta misma materia, con la orden, una orden muy especial que se da y que la traducción al español vendría siendo caballero de la Orden de la Bandera del gobierno de ese país. Y por supuesto también participa activamente en el mundo de las inversiones en Estados Unidos. De hecho, alguna época un fund que él ha liderado o que ha participado activamente tuvo una de las mejores rentabilidades del mundo. Y además, por si todo eso fuera poco, ha sido distinguido en el año 98 como una de las 20 personas más influyentes del planeta por World Trade Magazine. Así que thank you, Professor Hanke, for being with us. This is really an honor and a privilege for us to listen to you and learn from you, especially during these times where, economics is, again, in the agenda of so many people that thought that, we had achieved calm and peaceful, sort of sustained process of progress, and now we are facing this inflation and all of these problems. So thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Axel. Great to be with you too, and my friends down in Chile.
Yeah, we know you know a lot about Chile, and you have written and you know the history of this country and what happened here during the times when the Chicago Boys transformed the Chilean economy. You have written also with some of them. I saw you wrote something with Rolf Luders one time many years ago. And so what do you, that would be an interesting starting point. What's your assessment, of what happened in Chile? You have been advising governments in different parts of the world and observing different economic situations in different parts. So what would be your overall assessment of Chile in this context?
Well, in the context, when the reform started, almost from day one, I was associated. I'm still associated with Dr. Albert Friedberg in Toronto, Canada, and Friedberg and I, as investors as well as economists, because we're both, shall we say, Chicago/Austrian oriented in our thinking, kind of a mixed thing, but free market, classical liberal economist, and we always like to invest in places where they're making big liberal reforms, and the reason for that is clear. If you do invest in places that are liberalizing, you basically got the wind at your back. The trend is your friend, and the rate of return on assets is going through the ceiling if the reforms are successfully implemented. So Chile, when the reform started, we were extremely attracted, both from kind of a policy point of view, shall we say, our Austrian Chicago kind of thinking, free market thinking, but also as just a pure investment situation. So we were very attracted. You mentioned Rolf Luders. Of course, Rolf was one of the original Chicago boys. I think Rolf, I think, as Rolf once told me, I think he was the first Latin American PhD that Milton Friedman actually had, was Rolf Luders. Yeah. He did his PhD dissertation with Milton. So we became very good friends. We still are very good friends, of course, with Rolf, and there were other important personalities. Pepe Pinheira, of course, as you know, was very, very close to Friedberg and myself. And Friedberg actually was one of the first asset managers that was managing funds in the new private pension system. So in addition to our other investments, we were engaged in managing funds. So there's some experience there, let's put it that way. But the attraction, you see, the magnet, it's just like the magnet that occurred shortly thereafter in New Zealand. A Labour government, the Lange government, came in, but we had a huge liberal reform that followed, and we invested big in New Zealand. I was a president of our fund in New Zealand. Sir Roger Douglas, they call it Rogernomics there. They don't call it the Chicago boys, they call it Rogernomics. If you want to look in your economic history books, of another great reform that was done was in New Zealand. Huge liberalizations, very interesting, very successful. And so that's, those kind of places attract me.
So one of the common concepts that are used in the public debate, not only in Latin America but also in Europe or even the United States, when they take a look at the reforms that were implemented or were introduced in Chile or even New Zealand or other countries, it's the concept of neoliberalism. I don't like that concept. I'm very critical of the concept, but they usually link these reforms, neoliberalism, to the ideas of the Chicago School and Milton Friedman. And they complain and say that these reforms, in the case of Chile, for example, created a lot of inequality and were against public interest and that benefit the wealthy and things like that. They don't say that much about New Zealand, because for some reason New Zealand is a place that everyone likes, but I don't think there were very, in essence, such differences between what happened in New Zealand and Chile. Why do you think this is the case, that Chile is so heavily attacked and Milton Friedman is nowadays, and he has been for decades, so attacked by by some thinkers, intellectuals, and probably politicians also?
Well, this is an extremely interesting question, Axel, because I think there's several things. One is that the term neoliberalism, it's like a piñata that they want to beat up on. It means nothing. It's a code word. Yeah. It's a code word for anyone on the left uses neoliberalism, and it means everything bad. Whatever, it's just bad. So I don't like that term. It's a meaningless term, and then you get the personalities attached to it. Of course, Milton Friedman is enemy number one, and interestingly enough, Milton Friedman really wasn't the key personality involved in Chile. He had almost nothing. He indirectly in the sense that some of his students, like I mentioned, Luther's went back and is Chilean and things like that. But the key person really involved in the Chicago Boys reforms from Chicago was Al Harburger. It wasn't even Milton Friedman.
Yeah.
Now, none of these people on the left probably even know who Harburger is. But Friedman is an enemy. He's a target. And still to this day, there's a concerted international campaign to try to bury Friedman's ideas once and for all. This still goes on. I monitor how this works, and you will see operatives on the left and political parties all over the world tweeting every single day on anti-Milton Friedman tweets.
Well, this yeah.
He's very symbolic, and the reason why is that Friedman was not only a great economist, a great friend and a mentor of mine, but he was probably the world's greatest debater.
Yeah.
And master of rhetoric. And so he could deliver the classical liberal message probably more effectively than anyone living at the time. So he has a tremendous impact. He's still, if you look at YouTube, Milton Friedman's still all over YouTube. And so that's the man with the target on his back. If you're on the left, you're shooting at Milton Friedman. You have to get rid of Milton Friedman and Milton Friedman's ideas to move your own leftist agenda forward. If you can't get rid of Friedman, you have a big stumbling block all the time, you see. So yeah. I think that's part of the thing. And this neoliberal thing, it's strictly a Latino thing, by the way. It doesn't exist in the rest of the world. It doesn't exist.
You mean the concept? They don't use.
No. The term neoliberal doesn't exist in the rest of the world as it exists in Latin America. Yeah. And in Latin America, it's just a code word. It's just a code word. It's a meaningless code word.
So, yeah, I agree with you. Milton Friedman is probably the most effective public intellectual in the 20th century. I mean, he was also, of course, an academic, but he had this extraordinary power of convincing people with his arguments and the charisma to present them. But in terms of his contribution to the economic science, why is Friedman so relevant? Why, for people who don't know a lot,
Okay, he's very relevant. Let's just take the narrow aspect, and one that he's very known for, macroeconomics, and essentially he was a practitioner of the quantity theory of money, and in fact, more narrowly, the equation of exchange, MV, money times velocity, equals P, the price level, times Y, the real rate of potential growth in the economy. MV equals PY. Now that turns out to be, in macroeconomics, it is the theory of everything. That is macroeconomics. And that was Milton Friedman. Now, before him, another great economist that was a quantity theory person was Irving Fisher in the United States. And then we can go back before that. You have Locke and Hume and Adam Smith. Yeah. They're all using the quantity theory of money. So Milton Friedman is very associated with the quantity theory of money. MV equals PY. Now let's get this in a contemporary setting. Right now, in the Federal Reserve System, that's a central bank in the United States, the Federal Reserve, There's 785 economists that are employed in the Federal Reserve System. And none of those practices a quantity theory of money, none. And they all use something in the jargon of the trade, it's the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model for macroeconomics. It doesn't include money. The general stochastic equilibrium model does not include money, and if you don't use that, you're an outcast in monetary economics. So that's directly opposed to Friedman. Now let's go a little further here. We've got 785 economists at the Fed. None of them predicted that we would have an inflation problem in the United States. Right now, the inflation rate is still at a 40-year high, 8.3% per annum in the United States. And none of these economists saw that because they weren't using MV equals PY. Now, why weren't they using that? If you look at the economists at the Fed, the ratio of Democrats, that would be left of center, to Republicans, right of center, is 48.5 to 1. For every Republican, there are 48.5 Democrats working at the Fed as economists. And who is the number one enemy of Democrats in economics? Milton Friedman, still Milton Friedman. So if he's the enemy, what he's practicing has to be bad. That's the quantity theory of money, MV equals PY. So you get rid of that. So that my conjecture is that is why the quantity theory of money is not used by the Fed. And Chairman Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, in testimony last year before Congress, said that we have to unlearn the quantity theory of money. So this gets into this story about Friedman, the influence of Friedman. And if you look at the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, as far as I'm concerned, macroeconomics has gone backwards for the last 30 years that model has been in play and been used. And what it's done, it shoved the quantity theory out of the picture, and it shoved Milton Friedman out of the picture. And it's a political thing. It's strictly politics. And to get the numbers, remember that ratio, 48.5 on the left to 1 on the right, shall we say, employed by the Federal Reserve as professional economists. So that's what's going on. It's the same thing that you have going on in Chile.
Yeah. Yeah, although I think our central bank has been more responsible than the Fed when it comes to monetary policy over the last years.
Well, that to be better than the Fed is pretty easy to do. I mean, there are only a few places. Venezuela isn't as good. Zimbabwe isn't as good. Lebanon isn't as good. Sudan isn't as good. But you know, the list of those who are worse than the Fed in terms of recent performance since, let's say, since February of 2020, when the COVID pandemic started, the Fed went way off the rails and became really practitioners of what they call modern monetary theory.
Can you briefly explain, in terms for the layman, what is this idea of modern monetary theory, which is called modern, but it seems like it's not very modern. It's like old-fashioned inflationism. But you know, because for us in Latin America and students, many young people are watching this interview who are not necessarily economists. You know, this is something that's really you know, shocking to us to see that the United States is following something like that, when it's used to be our role model for our countries.
Well, in short, the modern monetary theory says you can print as much money as you want to, and it doesn't cause inflation. It's more or less like many older ideas that dominated Latin America for many decades, that kind of monetary thinking. So what happened in the United States, just to make it concrete, in February of 2020, the COVID pandemic was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. And at that time, the United States Congress, Trump was actually the president then, but the Congress started spending money like mad. And when they started spending a lot of money, the deficit became huge. And then the Fed jumped into the picture because with modern monetary theory, they monetized that deficit. And they monetized it by doing what? By financing the deficit, buying the government bonds that were being issued to cover the deficit, and the Fed was buying those. Now, how did they buy them? Well, they just printed money. They just they bought it with new credit they were creating. Now, a lot of people are very confused about this government spending thing, Axel. Government spending and deficits don't necessarily need to result in inflation. They only result in inflation if the central bank comes in and monetizes them and buys the bonds. If those bonds had been sold to the non-bank public, there wouldn't have been any inflation. There would be a big deficit. There'd be a lot of government spending. The bonds would be sold to the non-bank public, and Axel and Steve Hanke would be buying the bonds, and the money we're sending to buy the bonds would be taken out of our disposable income. So we would not have that ammunition to be spending. And also, by the way, interest rates would be going up to make those bonds attractive in the non-bank public marketplace. And those interest rate increases, of course, would be squeezing the economy and slowing it down, slowing things down. So our disposable income would be going down as we transferred money into the government, and interest rates would be going up, squeezing the economy as the bonds were being sold to the non-bank public. And so you wouldn't have inflation. Inflation, as Milton Friedman taught us a long time ago, is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It has to be created by the central bank producing excess money. And that's what happened in the United States. So yeah, I like this bathtub analogy that I have. What happens, the money comes into the monetary bathtub through the faucet. And since COVID started, that increase in M2, that measure of the money supply, is increased by about 41%. And there are two drains draining that money out. One accommodates real economic activity, real GDP growth, and the other one accommodates an increased demand for money. But that doesn't take everything away. And you're still left with about a 30% cumulative increase of excess money that's in the tub. And that will eventually go out with a lag of about 12 to 24 months as inflation, through the inflation overflow. So we still have in the United States about 30% of what was produced since the COVID pandemic that is excess that will be coming out of the overflow, and we will have inflation with us in the United States of probably 6% or more, lasting this year, 2022, 2023, into maybe even the start of 2024. So the inflation is not going away. That's a little lesson in basically the mechanics of how the quantity theory of money works and the equation of exchange.
So do you think that after this, big mistake that the Fed made, and also the European Central Bank and other central banks who thought this is going to be transitory inflation and it's going to go away, that Milton Friedman's idea of inflation being a monetary phenomenon will be vindicated, and they will admit that they were wrong, and then we will have maybe these economists at the Fed changing their views somewhat, or do you think this is gonna do nothing in order to convince them that Milton Friedman was right?
I think it will be hard. I think, of course, Milton Friedman will be vindicated. I don't think it will change attitudes very much at the Fed, because these people are, as I say, they're ideological. They have a direction, and they've been trained with this dynamic stochastic general equilibrium kind of model. So they're not trained properly, number one. And they have this little ideological background or baggage. So Milton will be vindicated for sure, but I don't think that it will change things very rapidly in Washington, D.C. Now let me make a very important point that people can understand. And this is another reason why Friedman is right and everybody else is wrong. If you look at the inflation is not a global problem. People say it's a global problem. It is not. Inflations are local problems created by local central banks. Now it happens, unfortunately, that a lot of central banks copy the US Federal Reserve, like the European Central Bank, for example, and the result is that they have inflation just like the United States right now. But let's look at places that are following Friedman. One that's interesting is China. The Communist Party follows Friedman. They're monetarists. They don't have inflation. Inflation is just a little over 1% in China right now. Japan, the inflation rate is about 1% in Japan right now. The money supply is like China, it's under control. Switzerland, the hard money capital of the world. Switzerland's inflation is only about 2.5%. So all of those three countries are practicing a form of the quantity theory of money, if you will. They're Friedmanites, and they have controlled their money supply, and their inflation rates are controlled. That's happening right now, today.
So what did change at the Fed? Because one would think that under Alan Greenspan, for example, and under Ben Bernanke, they would follow Friedman. Bernanke was a student of the Great Depression, and he's claimed that he had learned from Friedman. And Alan Greenspan was someone who was even a gold standard at some point in his life. So when did this change, or was it always like that?
I think it changed. That I think the last monetarist we really had at the Fed was Paul Volcker.
Okay.
Paul Volcker was a monetarist, and President Reagan let him, gave him a free hand to kill inflation, and he did it. And he was blatantly a monetarist. He was watching the money supply. After Volcker, the emphasis on the money supply started dying away, and even the Fed's reporting of the money supply has gotten sloppy. We don't even report M3 anymore. That was dropped in 1980. I might have my dates wrong here. It was dropped after Volcker. And so they don't report all the monetary statistics. Now they don't even report M2 on a weekly basis as they used to. They just report it once a month. So the whole thing with looking at the money supply has been very, very downgraded over time. This has taken time. It didn't happen overnight, but if we get into Bernanke, now Bernanke's kind of an interesting case actually, because number one, Bernanke is not a monetarist, but he is a student of economic history and certainly a student of Friedman in the monetary sense. So what happened in the Great Recession that started in 2007, 2008 is a very interesting case, because what happened then is that the politicians in Washington blame that Great Recession on the bankers and banks. And they passed some legislation called the Dodd-Frank legislation. And that legislation kind of strangled the banks. It put a lot of more regulations on banks. And at the same time, there was something called the Basel III capital requirements came in. A lot tougher capital requirements were coming from Basel and the Basel regulations. So the Dodd-Frank regulations and the Basel III came in right as the Great Recession started. And most of the money supply, people don't realize, most of the money supply in normal times in most countries, it's not created by central banks. It's created by commercial banks. In the United States, at the start of the Great Recession, 90% of the money supply was being produced by commercial banks. They were the elephant in the room. And with these new regulations and the capital requirements, the contribution of broad money being created by the commercial banks started going down, actually. It was tremendously pro-cyclical, not contra-cyclical. So Bernanke was smart enough, I think, to introduce quantitative easing 1 and quantitative easing 2 and quantitative easing 3. And what that did, the Fed's contribution to broad money counteracted the fall in the contribution that the commercial banks were making. And on balance, it mitigated the damage that was being done with all these regulations and so forth. But the broad money supply, most people don't realize. Many remember all the gold bugs and hard money people were saying, oh, the Fed's balance sheet is exploding. We're going to have hyperinflation in the United States. And QE1, QE2, QE3, that was a complete irresponsible disaster. No. It wasn't at all. The money supply broadly measured by, let's say the broadest measure, M4, which is done by the Center for Financial Stability in New York, that never was growing more than about 5.5%. And that's why we never had inflation. We never had inflation with all that quantitative easing. And it took us a long time to get out of the Great Recession. Because why? The money supply was not, in fact, growing very fast.
Yeah.
And so this is a key story. Most people still to this day do not understand what was happening in the Great Recession. And what was happening, on balance, the broad money was growing very slowly, and we had, of course, no inflation. To get the inflation target, by the way, if you solve MV equals PY, MV equals PY, you solve that for M to get what I call the golden growth rate for the money supply. And the golden growth rate is a growth rate that would be consistent with a 2% inflation target of the Fed. The golden growth rate in the United States, it's about 5 or 6%.
Yeah.
5 or 6%. We never were growing really in that range, and that's why we never could hit the inflation target coming out of the Great Recession.
And now since COVID, that golden rate has been tripled, right? It's
the golden growth rate on average, Axel, we've been growing since COVID on average at about 18%.
18%, right? And so you expect inflation to be with us for at least 2 more years or even more. So how do we solve the problem? What does the Fed has to, and the European Central Bank for that matter? Do you see problems in the Eurozone coming, for instance? What is going to happen when the Fed tries to, suck out this liquidity that they create?
Okay, so number one, you have to remember the Fed has created all this inflation, and now they're flying blind. They're like in an airplane without an altimeter in it, because they're not looking at the money supply. They are looking at two instruments that they're going to try to wring inflation out of the system with. One is to increase the interest rates, the federal funds rate, and two is to shrink the size of the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. So the best we can hope for is that as they start increasing the federal funds rate and as they start shrinking the balance sheet, that they start looking at the money supply number to see what they're actually doing. Because if they don't, they'll keep flying blind, and we're liable to have a big crash.
A big crash. So you think another financial crisis could happen? Like a big one?
I think with flying blind without an altimeter, without looking at the money supply, you have a high probability of having a crash if you have these two instruments. You're trying to deal with those two instruments and flying the plane, but you don't exactly know what your elevation is. And so there's a big problem. You can have a crash. So that if we did, and I think there's a high probability that we will, maybe over a 60 or 70% probability we'll have a recession. And then we would have stagflation, because we would still have the inflation, the excess money coming out of the bathtub. Okay, that's going to happen no matter what. And if we had a recession, of course, the real GDP growth component of nominal GDP will come down. So you have the worst of both worlds. So that is a possibility, and it's a problem, especially for countries like Chile, they're producing raw materials, exporting things like copper. Copper's, if we have a recession in the United States, that's a problem for some of the raw material markets that are involved, that are being produced by Chile. So it affects it that way. It affects it another way, in the sense that the only way to keep the peso stable in this kind of environment where the federal funds interest rates are going up is for the central bank in Chile to follow suit. They have to continue to increase their interest rates and the reason they have to do that, the only way people are interested in going into investing long in the peso is to pick up some carry.
Yeah.
You have to pick up carry, and the only way they can keep the carry attractive, that is the interest rate spread between Chile and the United States, the only way to keep that spread positive and in favor of the peso is if the central bank in Chile keeps increasing their interest rate. If not, the carry gets reduced and it becomes a lot less attractive to be carrying a peso. Yeah. Why would I want to be carrying a peso if I wasn't getting paid carry to do it?
Yeah, and we are moving towards, we have already like 8-9% interest rates set by the central bank, and that we are moving to probably have 10% very soon. So that's exactly right. It's exactly what's happening, what you are saying. And if inflation continues in the United States, it's going to be a big problem for us. And if commodity prices fall, even a worse problem. So I wanted to, before we finish, ask you an additional question, because it looks like many economists nowadays have unlearned monetarism, like Jerome Powell said. And what happened with the teachings of the Chicago School of Economics? You have so many Nobel Prizes in the Chicago School of Economics. You had great free market champions like Arnold Harberger, like Milton Friedman, like Gary Becker, and many others. And it looks like not even at Chicago, you know, the legacy of the Chicago school has been preserved. Or am I wrong in that?
No. Let me, before I answer that, Axel, it's a good question. The key thing with the peso, you see, in a place like Chile, if you don't have a stable peso, you've got it's a real problem in fighting inflation.
Yeah.
If you let the peso weaken, you're going to have a big problem with inflation. So let's go to Chicago. So the Chicago school is interesting because it always had a style of being kind of, shall we say, controversial. They like combat, but it became that was since day one, since the end when it was formed in 1892 or whatever the date was. I can't remember exactly, but at any rate, they always were kind of outsiders who liked to argue and debate about things. But it was kind of eclectic. They had a broad range of people. I mean, even Thorsten Veblen was a professor at Chicago, you know. So he was an institutionalist. So they had all kinds of people. Okay, everybody, very, very open, very, very diverse. Then the Chicago school started really, and it started with the big three were Milton Friedman, George Stigler, and Aaron Director. Those were the big three. That was the core of the Chicago school. And then kind of around the Mont Pelerin Society in those days, it started and it became much more uniform and much more free market. And since Friedman retired, Stigler retired, Becker retired, it's become again a much more diverse group. So I would say at present it really doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
There are a few people who look very much like Friedman, Becker, Stigler, Al Harberger, Fama, and other Chicago people, but those are people in a minority now. I would say they're in a minority now. So that's the picture. I mean, we can get into more detail about that, but that's I think my general picture is accurate.
So where would you go study economics if you had to choose a university nowadays in the US?
I'd probably still go to Chicago. You're asking me where do I send my students, and it probably would still be Chicago.
Probably would still. That's good.
Now it's a little diverse. I mean, the last really good one I had, he went to Stanford. It's always one of the big three or four. Forget the rest of it. It just doesn't count.
It doesn't count.
I mean, you know, you've got to go to the one. My recommendation always is, if you want, we died out there, Axel. It depends on what you want to do, Axel. If you want to be an academic, you've got to go to one of the big five. If you're going into business and finance and so forth, that's a different story. You have a much wider kind of selection. So it depends on the personality, but I'm still so old-fashioned. My knee-jerk reaction is Chicago.
That's good to know. I mean, there are many young students here listening to this or watching this interview, and they will be interested to know your opinion on where they should go to pursue a PhD, for instance, or you know, we have a long tradition of Chileans going to study at Chicago. So that makes sense.
It's still safe bet.
Okay, it's a safe
Oh,
bet.
by the way, one thing, no matter what, it is one of the big five. So no matter what your interest, orientation, whether just because it's not the old Chicago doesn't mean that it's not in the big five. It's definitely in the big five.
So Chicago, Stanford, Princeton, Yale, Harvard, MIT, something like that.
Yeah, and Stanford. Did you say Stanford?
Yeah. Yes.
Stanford.
And one final question, Steve. What would you say, or why would you think that Milton Friedman is still relevant today for for young people to read his works and to get to know him beyond the inflation problem? Why do you think he's still relevant today? We know about what's going on with monetary policy and all of that. It's very technical, but he wasn't only interested in technical economics. So
no, I think young people should be go to YouTube and watch lectures that Friedman is giving, and he was a man of clarity. So whether you agree with Friedman or you disagree is irrelevant. The thing is, he was a good pedagogue, and if you listen to him, you will learn something. It's like listening. I like to listen to Thomas Sowell on YouTube, because Sowell, he's a good pedagogue. He by the way, he is a Chicago PhD. He was one of Stiegler's students, but Sowell, these people are clear. You don't want to waste your time with people who are not clear and to the point. And Friedman delivered his message. He was clear and he delivered his message. Okay, you might not agree with his message, but at least you know what it is.
Yeah. And I was very much inspired in his work as a public intellectual, and I think he has inspired many people who believe in freedom, and especially in countries like Latin America. That's very important.
See, this is you mentioned the word freedom. Now, this is the thing that was at the center of the old Chicago school. Forget about all the fancy modeling and everything else. No matter what, they were always primarily interested in liberty. So and in Latin America, we know what the word liberty means. In Latin America, they know what that means.
Yeah, and we need it more than ever in our countries. The word and the fight for freedom, which is something that's very fragile in our region. So we want to thank you. Yeah.
Well, unfortunately, it's pretty fragile in the United States too.
Yeah, we need more Friedman in the United States too. Unfortunately, there is too much of the opposite views and philosophies everywhere, and it's he has somehow become this demonized figure. I heard, and this is a final comment, maybe you are interested to hear that someone from Chile was doing a PhD in the United States, and she wanted to do something on James Buchanan, and the professors basically told her not to go with Buchanan. He was completely canceled by these professors. So you cannot even cite Buchanan now.
Well,
in some schools at least.
You see, there's a lot of that canceling going on, which is quite unfortunate. But one thing I can tell you in macroeconomics, and this in a way has nothing to do with Friedman, but this dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model that is dominant in macroeconomics. If you don't embrace that, and you're an academic and you're writing in macroeconomics, you are canceled.
Yeah, exactly. That's how academia works right now. It's the fashion. You have to follow that, and if you don't, you are canceled not for being politically incorrect, but for not using the same methodology or intellectual tools.
So this gets into one thing. If you want to be free, you have to be independent. Now what that means is you have to be able to finance yourself if you want to be free.
Don't aspire to tenure at the university.
Yeah, right.
So that's with that. On that note, we can finish this very interesting conversation. Thank you very much.
Axel, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
El Líbero, la realidad como no la habías visto.
Haz que estos contenidos lleguen más lejos haciéndote miembro de la Red Líbero.